The technology gods are against me today because it took 3 or 4 people here to get this talk working. But I will be talking about eComma, textual annotation and collaborative reading in a foreign language. And so if you remember, this has been a very intense conference, lots of talks, right? And so the talk I gave a couple days ago about open education and OER, if you kind of remember back that far, I was talking about the whole kind of ecology of these new pedagogical materials that are more dynamic and that are open to the public that we can all create together. So I'm going to give you an example today of that, which really, I think, emphasizes the notion of openness as well as centrally the notion of collaboration. And hopefully both the internet and my PowerPoint will work together. That was one of the problems here. So just in case I can't get the internet to work, I do have on the PowerPoint, this is what it would look like if you go to so what I'm talking about today is a piece of software. It's web-based software that is coming. It's in development. We're beta testing it, and it should be launched hopefully by the beginning of next year. So January 2013. It will be open to the public. In fact, it is open source, so that if your institution, your agency wanted to take it and play with it and run with it, you can do that. So what I want to start off with to kind of set up the notion of this tool is to talk a little bit about reading and your conceptions, our conceptions of what reading is. What do you do when you read? Both from a social point of view and a cognitive point of view, so kind of the socio-cultural point of what is reading. And I want to make you think about reading as a team sport, because we've all been socialized into literacy practices to think about reading as something that we do as an individual. And to think about this, of course, where do you go? You go to the internet, and I wanted to get some images to think about reading. And if you do a Google search, you go to Google Images and you type in something like reading well, yeah, that's what I did. I started with reading. You get lots of images that look like this. Thousands of images that look somewhat similar to this. Of course, I'm a French professor, so I had to choose Fragonard. So in the 1700s, we have a woman and a book. Fast forward about 100 years later, or earlier, into the future, again, Corot, a famous French painter, a woman, and a book. Bringing us more into the 20th century, we have Picasso and, okay, this is a woman, 2 women. He did a series of paintings, actually, which were called Woman and a Book. So you've seen a pattern develop here. Obviously, literacy practices are highly gendered. So we now know that women read books. And throughout history, women, there's a very strong correlation with certain kinds of literary genres and certain genders, right? So if you're reading literature in the 17th, 18th century, of course, it was kind of considered something for a woman. If you're reading a secular text, if you're reading a sacred text, that's something for men to do. Into the 21st century, I found more images, modern images of now we finally get men. So men do read, and we have, both of them are books. And finally, right up to the moment, we have somebody reading, because I found a couple images of reading devices. So whatever they are, Kindles or your cell phones, whatever. Okay, but if you notice, all of those pictures were of an individual reading something. So I searched for the Google search I then tried was collaborative reading, or a new term that's now come into usage called social reading. And this is what I find. Mother and child, lots of pictures of parents reading to their children. So I would simply say that, I mean, there are a lot of variations on this theme, but there's the expert and the novice. You also find kind of pedagogical pictures, or pictures in the classroom. Now, we can talk about this. Are they actually all doing the same thing? I would say, no, they're not. They're being read to. So they're participating together, but they actually have very different roles, obviously. So the teacher knows how to read, the children know how to listen. That's not quite the same thing. But I came across this picture, collaborative reading. And this is more what I want to talk about today. We're getting closer to what I'm talking about. So the notion has been around for a while. This picture looks kind of old, 80s or something. And it turns out, this was taken from a book, the cover of a book. It turns out that collaborative strategic reading is a technique that was pioneered right here in the University of Texas by some reading researchers, as you see. And they've published quite a series of articles on this. And so the main idea, of course, is now we have a group of people, and they are all readers, but they're trying to create the meaning from the text collaboratively. So we have the boy who's reading aloud, and other people are giving him feedback, or they're making comments. So reading and commenting, commentary, and maybe even asking questions. Are you sure you think that that's correct? That's the notion that I want to talk about today with eComma. And this activity, of course, is moving now online. So the other big idea, of course, then is the notion of collaboration. That's a small group, but when you move to the internet, you leverage the power of openness, or you leverage the power of size. So everybody's talking about mass collaboration. It's no longer just a small group of 6 people. We can actually have 1 million people reading the same text, right? And that's actually happening. That may not be a good thing, by the way. I don't know. I mean, we're trying this out. So if you look at the popular literature on the internet and things like crowdsourcing or the wisdom of crowds, this notion of distributed cognition or collective cognition, we think, these are all recent books, Mass Innovation, Crowdsourcing, The Power of the Crowd. If you notice, there are a lot of books on written by people in business, because again, they're very interested in leveraging the power of the internet. This is, though, a very good, so I was talking earlier about open education. If I have one book to tell you to take a look at, if you want to really understand open education, this is it. Curtis Bonk is an instructional technologist and professor of education at Indiana University. And he has published, this book came out about 2 years ago. And he does a very nice job of looking at all the different ways that this open ecology is impacting education. If you take a look at inside, just to kind of go down the contents here, he's talking about search engines and free software and open courseware, MIT, I mentioned that the other day, portals for people, making contribution, and Chapter 8, collaborate or die. So again, I want to talk about this notion of collaboration, which I'm trying to promote among teachers. Let's work together. When I ended up my talk the other day with Clay Shirky's cover and talking about cognitive surplus, if we can collaborate effectively, we can actually produce something for the common good. In the far fringes of this movement, there's something called edupunk. Believe it or not, so we can collaborate so that we can subvert the paradigm, so that we can overthrow the University of Texas. So that's true, that's out there. That's part of the open education movement. And there are people who self-identify as edupunks. 2 years ago, I went to something called South by Southwest, which is a large kind of happening here in March or April. It changes. And it started as a music festival, and then it also grew into incorporate cinema, and now we have interactive, so digital, and finally we have the educators joining the fun. So it's this huge mass event. Hundreds of thousands of people come to this, and so I attended a talk by edupunks, about 100 people, self-identified edupunks, and they were very much using the power of the internet to redo or remake education in their image. Not everybody agrees with this, though. And there is this book came out a couple of years ago. So all of these books came out about 2010, 2009. The Dumbest Generation, How the Digital Age Stupefies Young Americans and Jeopardizes Our Future. And if you look at open it up to Knowledge Deficits, Chapter 1. Chapter 2, The New Bibliophobes. So this, of course, is written by an English professor, and he doesn't really believe, from Emory University, he really fundamentally believes that when you're reading on the internet, you're not reading. This was captured, actually, in an article a couple of years ago in the New York Times. So there is this big debate, which I'm basically showing you with these covers of books. Are you really reading when you're reading on the internet? So, okay, we've been looking at the semiotics of images. Let's take a look at this one. The dad is reading the newspaper. Remember, I said that literacy practices are highly gendered. Mom, we have a woman and a book, okay? And we don't know what she's reading, what genre it is, but it's a book, okay? And the kids are on the internet. What are they reading? We don't know. But the point is, yeah, they may be gaming, but that's reading too, right? So there are literacy practices that require some kind of level of participation. My main point here, then, going through all these slides, is to say that the mom and the dad are doing something that's fundamentally individual. They're lost in a book, which, I mean, I love, right? So I enjoy being by my own self in a book. But the kids are probably not just reading, they're probably doing whatever it is they're doing with a bunch of other people. Okay. Now, about 2 years ago, I was riding in my car, and I heard this by NPR. And I hope this plays. We'll see if it does. I'll just play a little bit of this to give you a flavor of it.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And I'm Steve Inskeep. Good morning. 10 years ago... Novels on cell phones. Technology has changed the way we read. And here, Larry takes a look at how technology may be transforming how people write.
Nicholas Carr is a writer who has thought of himself as a serious reader of books all his life.
Over just the last couple of years, I've really noticed that if I sit down with a book after a few paragraphs, I'll say, where's the links, where's the email, where's all this stuff going on, and it's kind of sad.
In an Atlantic article, Carr argued that the internet is training us to read in a distracted and disjointed way. But does that mean writers will have to change the way they write to capture the attention of a different kind of reader? Carr thinks yes, and he looks to the past to make his point.
When printed books first became popular, thanks to Gutenberg's press, you saw this great expansion of experimentation, and all of which came out of the fact that here was a technology that encouraged people to read deeply and read with great concentration and focus. And I think as we move to the new technology of the screen, it has a very different effect, almost the opposite effect, and you'll see a retreat from the kind of sophistication and eloquence that characterized the printed page.
Okay, so I'm not going to play you the whole, it's about a 5-minute little reportage about the idea that this new form of reading is now having this washback effect on actual writing. So literacy practices are changing. That much is pretty clear, but what struck me was the way people talked about this division between Gutenberg's print, so the associations, the attitudes that we have with the printed world, and then the attitudes that these various people were talking about in the digital world. So he said it's a retreat. These literacy practices on the internet are a retreat from sophistication and eloquence, he actually said. And there were a lot of people who were 50 and above who agreed with him. And if you listen to the whole 5-minute little story there, the print is about savoring pages and lingering on the language and beautiful language. It's the aesthetics of print. And digital was described as disjointed and scrolling and propulsive and attention-grabbing and pulpy and on and on and on. Okay, it was the connotation, positive versus negative, was really striking. So everybody talks about Gutenberg, and I've given you one theorist who's in, actually, he is a scholar of Shakespeare, Tom Pettit. He talks about the Gutenberg parenthesis, and the idea of a parenthesis is that it's actually an interruption It interrupts the flow of the sentence, the flow of an idea. And so obviously we talk about before Gutenberg and after Gutenberg. So he notes, I won't go through everything he says, but that many of the literacy practices that are associated with the digital world today are actually practices that we can associate with pre-Gutenberg, pre-print time. So this notion that I was talking about with OER, where you can take it and you can remix it and you can mash things together, of course. It even says, you know, Shakespeare stole lots of good ideas. The idea of sampling has been around for a long time. But his main point is that print, how we conceptualize print, as well as all the attitudes that go with it, is what he calls the dead center of the parenthesis. It kind of stopped. So I have the attitudes and the concepts with digital here in red. So there is somebody who preceded Tom Pettit who talked about something very similar, and that's Walter Ong in a great book in the 80s called Literacy and Orality. He talks about the psychodynamics of literacy and orality. And so he says, you know, in an oral culture, in a primary oral culture where you don't have literacy, which is very hard for us to imagine, those of us who are hyperliterate. If you're teaching, you know, at a university, everybody you talk to knows what literacy is or can read and write. But if you are in a culture that has no written system for the language, that's what he's talking about, and people don't really know what a book is, then you have to develop different kinds of techniques to remember, to use your language in particular ways. So an oral culture prefers additive rather than subordinative structures, and this, and this, and this. Aggregative rather than analytic, redundant rather than succinct. So if you look at medieval, at the troubadours, and that was it's oral literature, it strikes us as very redundant because it's on and on and on. Here and now, rather than then and there and then. And this, the last one, is what I want to focus on, participatory rather than individual. So even with the troubadours and other forms of oral literature, there was always a refrain. You always had the audience. So it's the teacher and the students together creating whatever the genre was. Ong went on to talk about then secondary orality. He says, you know, in modern age, we have these technological tools that are in some way, and this is in the 80s. I mean, people think about the internet, and there's been an explosion in studies of media studies, but he was very much ahead of his time. He said that, the quote here, essentially a more deliberate and self-conscious orality based on the use of writing and print. So lots of people have made the point that the internet is this hybrid kind of notion of both oral and literate. In fact, maybe a better way to think about this is really in terms of planning. So we tend to associate orality with spontaneity, what's on our mind. So it's really unplanned discourse, whereas most forms of writing are planned. So it's not necessarily that it's writing versus oral. It's really how much time you have to plan. Because obviously if you're texting, and I saw some of you texting here, you're doing it right in the moment. Okay, so we now have hybrid forms. Okay, so I mentioned the notion of attitudes that we have about our literacy practices. And I want to talk about a little bit then about this notion of epistemology, or how you create knowledge, which of course is very value-laden. There are some universities that will not allow their students to use Wikipedia. Because Wikipedia, as we know, is bad, it's inaccurate, it's full of problems, and it's not a legitimate source. Okay, well, there are actually people who are epistemologists who study how knowledge is created, and they've actually done kind of this cost-benefit analysis of various forms, digital forms, such as Wikipedia. And I just want to give you a quote before we dive into that of studies. This is a great quote that I found, and it comes from the former, well, I'll read it. Somebody who reads Wikipedia, this was actually taken from The Economist, so British context. Somebody who reads Wikipedia is, quote, rather in the position of a visitor to a public restroom, says Mr. McHenry, Britannica's former editor. Former. I should have underlined that. He's no longer, right? It may be obviously dirty. I should be reading this with a British accent. It may be obviously dirty so that he knows to exercise great care. or it may seem fairly clean, so that he may be lulled into a false sense of security. What he certainly does not know is who has used the facilities before him. And then The Economist editorializes, one wonders, so we already know it's British because one wonders whether people like Mr. McHenry would prefer there to be no public laboratories at all. So, yes, the point is that there are many professors who would prefer there to be no Wikipedia. Okay. So what is it? If you try to think about what is it good for and what is it bad for, most people, when they talk about reading and they're trying to get information, accuracy is very important for epistemology, the construction of knowledge. And that's really the focus of the debate. Is it accurate? And so, or is this information true? Okay, I want to add on to because there are other things to think about. There's something called verifiability. So are the sources trustworthy? So when was the last time you checked a source in the Encyclopedia Britannica? Excuse me. Or when was the last time you actually used the Encyclopedia Britannica? Right? Nobody uses that anymore. Which is another point, which is rarely made in these debates, is why are we going back and comparing apples and oranges when nobody eats this apple anymore? Okay, well, you can actually verify some of the information on Wikipedia because they're trails, the crumbs, they're called links, but you can't do that very easily in the print world. Okay, now we're into the digital because it's red, it's bad, it's edgy. But there's something else to think about when in constructing knowledge, and that's speed. How fast can you get at this? And of course, that wins hands down in the digital. By the way, Encyclopedia Britannica, which is always used to hit Wikipedia over the head with, right? This is so much better. They finally have given up, and they've decided as of last year they're not going to print it anymore. It's going to be digital from now on. So they agree. Yes, it can be acquired much faster. Power is another epistemic value. How much knowledge can be, how much of this can we acquire, how quickly? And fecundity, how many people can acquire the knowledge, which is a really important thing for me in open education because we want people to have access to this knowledge. Okay, all of that is kind of setting up where I'm going to go with eComma. So it's not terribly easy to see, but eComma is a tool for doing collaborative reading. It's a tool for textual annotation, but really the idea came out of a colleague of mine here at the University of Texas, Sam Baker in the English department, and his graduate students developed this tool because they wanted to be able to teach their students how to do a close reading of a literary text. That's what you do in English. In the courses that he was teaching, actually freshman English. So we have T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland here on the left here, and I can see if I can read. The river's tint is broken, the last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. Okay. And you can see that, so over to the left we have, here's the text. Over here we have a word cloud. So the text then is taken apart and is represented iconically in alphabetical order. The larger the word, of course, then the more times it appears, frequency. Okay. So again, the idea is that everybody is reading this text at the same time, and we have given them other tools. So what would you do with the word cloud? Well, you could click on this button here, and it shows you then all the instances of and, right? It's pretty simple. You all have seen word clouds now. So you can start to do very, very quickly kind of a structural analysis. There are two basic things, two functions that we want our students to do. So they're going to choose a piece of the text. They can annotate the text, drag, scroll over a piece of the text, and then they can either tag it or they can comment on it. And tag is going to be a short description, usually just one word. It's kind of a label. Aha, all of this, that's a metaphor. Boom, metaphor. And this, that's metonymy, or whatever it is that they're talking about. All right? Then the blue here, that little star, is going to be a comment, so it's a more fully developed idea. I think that the reason he's using metaphors is because blah, 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 blah. Okay? So that's all. That's all this is doing. It's giving them a space where people together can come around a text and mark it up, but they're tagging and they're commenting. So this creates something called tag clouds. So people over here, we have then, as they're creating it, it starts to grow. So when people use the word imagery, if somebody uses the word imagery as a tag and other people say, yeah, I like that word, that's a good tag, they start to look for images and they start to use that somebody else's tag. And notice that imagery is big because it's just like all the other principles of word clouds. It grows with its usage. So the more frequent the use of that tag, the bigger it is. Okay, and so we can see all of these people here have used this tag imagery, and then there's something called a heat map. So it starts to glow, the text starts to glow, and it shows you, if you click on this, what parts of the text were annotated according to this particular tag. Okay, they can also, I'm going to skip ahead here. Okay, posting comments. So comments is the same thing. Somebody drags over the text. And let me get to it. What would they do? What kinds of comments do they make? Because this is one of the things I'm interested in, is looking at this notion of textual interpretation as a highly collaborative activity. Well, they can paraphrase somebody else's previous comment. So look at this. Syncing refers to, and they've right here they've highlighted the word sync, and they write, syncing refers to negative things happening. If something is sinking, it is going down. It can also symbolize defeat. And then somebody responds to that, agreed. The harder one tries to get out of sinking sand, the further they sink. Kind of the same idea, yeah? Okay, so the point is that it can be very interactive. In fact, this, I know it's very hard to read here, but the first river, and it says, the river's tent is broken, and then the first comment is, the river seems to be mentioned because the river is supposed to flow, yet it is broken. And then all of these other people make comments about the comment. So how many of you actually will read the Washington Post or the Times, and then have any of you commented on an article? No hands? A couple hands? Okay. So what happens, of course, is that you have an editorial that may be 500 words, and the comments may be several thousand words, right? So this creates a huge amount of verbiage that they are having to read. Okay, there's also, in these discussions, a lot of disagreement. It's not always happy. Brown. Brown is a dull color, very boring and uneventful, there to describe life in the wasteland. I don't think brown means uneventful. It seems as though there's a lot happening here. And then writes back, figuratively, okay? So you didn't really understand. They get very, very snarky, actually. So they start to evaluate each other's comments. And so somebody makes this comment up here, and Kevin goes, I like the way you deduce such vast knowledge. I bet Wikipedia is how you find all the work you do. And he's right, because one of the main points is that they are using all kinds of other tools. Because this is web-based and they're on the internet, they are using everything else at their disposal that they know how to use. So Google, they're doing Google searches, they're using Wikipedia, they're using all these other things that may trouble some of their professors. Here somebody talks about Lake Geneva, because that's referred to. Les Mans in French means Lake Geneva. It's an archaic word for mistress, and somebody says, where did you find that? Wikipedia and he said, no, I looked it up on Google Maps. Okay, I just mentioned that. He talks about the title of the wasteland, finds this interesting information, and where did you Google that? Okay, then the notion of secondary orality of all these comments. Let's see. I'm not even sure what I mean by that slide, so I'll just keep going up. So This has been used, we've been trying this tool out. So that's the basic premise. That's all it really is. It's very simple, which is why I think it works nicely. And when I first went to a talk given by this English professor and he was showing me, I thought this would be, I can understand that this is great for close reading of a literary text. But when you're doing a foreign language, it's always close reading, especially in the lower levels. They are literally trying to figure out what the verb is or what the argument structure is, what's the subject, what's going on. And wouldn't it be great if they could actually do this more collaboratively? So that's all I was thinking about. I was thinking about immediately of all the different ways I would like to use this in my classroom. And we have been testing this out then in foreign languages. Actually, we've tested it on, it's been tested on many different readers, groups of readers. So it was tested with a legal brief in the law school using law professors, and they were highly argumentative, not surprising. We've used it, so it depends obviously a lot on the text as to what people are going to do with it. So it was used over here at the Harry Ransom Center, and there was an installation of the Rubaiyat, and so this great epic Persian text, and they gave it to then various curators, people who actually knew the text very well, and they went through and they edited, they annotated the text, and they made comments. So it's a commentary. And you could click then on different readers for their different interpretation of the text, which I thought was a very effective way of using it. Okay, so let me summarize then. What are we finding? These emergent practices, reading practices, collaborative practices. One of the things that they actually are using are this idea of visualization of collective interpretation. So that's what are the heat maps, or what I'm calling this aggregated data. So they start to use these tools to see properties in the text that they may have missed, and that really helps if you're looking for structural patterns. Reading is socially organized behavior. This blew me away. I was actually in a class where I heard this: I'll take the verbs, you take the nouns. So in other words, if I have a text in front of me and I have other people here who I can assume are my resources, let's divide and conquer. And there's sometimes, you could leave that open as a teacher, but you could also tell them kind of what roles you want them to play. But if you leave it open, they're going to figure out how to attack the text themselves, which I thought was really pretty fascinating. By the way, I should mention that I've given this talk to different audiences or variations of this audience, and I gave this a variation of this talk to my French literary colleagues, and I think their heads were about to explode at the end of this, particularly with these reading practices, because they didn't agree. They didn't want, this really bothered them a lot. Markup and interpretation freed from textual hierarchy, which is a fancy way of saying, hey, I'm going to start at the end. I don't have to start at the beginning. I'm going to read it backwards, or I'm going to start in the middle. I'll take the middle part, you take the beginning, and so they start to divide it up. And then together we'll piece it together. So as I've already mentioned this one, digital tools mediate the whole reading process. So they're using all kinds of different things. And folksonomies, so tags as folk taxonomies, you can then get a snapshot after you look at all the tag clouds, and see how the group is actually thinking about this various text. What are their labels for what's going on in the text? So we have evidence that students are actually using these to help understand the meaning of the text. Now, we want to explore its applications in the foreign language classroom, and there are lots of different things to look at. I mentioned at the beginning that this is going to be launched in 2012, so we're beta testing it. So if any of you want to use it, and it's free, there's no password, there's no fee, check back in the Coral website, and hopefully it'll be launched next year. So this would then, once we get it really launched, we want to then kind of see this open research project and have people who are sending in kind of their data or their case studies to us to find out about what is social reading and how does it work in a foreign language classroom. But there are many things to look at. I already mentioned synchronicity. So the synchronous versus asynchronous is very important in how people use computer-mediated tools. And it's very different. So I've given homework assignments, read this text and comment on it, annotate it on it. And if it's an asynchronous environment where they're doing it as homework, they do not read each other. Why would they? It's not really it's just more homework. If it's all together and we're trying to figure out this text in 40 minutes, then they read each other a lot. And they do a lot more of this kind of divide and conquer. Different genres have very different effects on how the tool is being used. And of course, different pedagogical practices. One of the things I saw in that I thought was really interesting in the English literature classroom, he actually handed out cards where people had different things to look for in the text. So you have 20 people annotating the text, but they're annotating it for different things. So it became, it was still collaborative, but in a way the teacher intervened to set the parameters so that it was a little bit neater than it might have been. So you go through and look for all 15 examples of metaphor, for example. And finally, different readers use this tool differently. That's not surprising. So, how am I doing on time?
You have 10 minutes.
I have 10. Okay. So, I pray this will work. Let's go to a demo. Let's see if this is actually going to work here. And this is its latest instantiation. We've gone through, as I said, we're beta testing it, and we have done. We've cleaned up. I see Natalie is in the back, the head programmer for this. Natalie, wave your hand. Thank you, Natalie. So we've been testing this on doing usability studies with different users, and I think we're getting better at this. The interface is cleaner and neater. As I get older, I can't see small fonts, so I keep telling her, make the fonts bigger. Okay, but so here is something that I used in a linguistics class last semester. And I'll just read some of the first part here. Mot élevé ici en dedans la paroisse Saint-Martin, au roi Bayutech en haut de la terre solo. Mon papa t'a hérité la terre. Okay, this is not French. No, it's not French. This is Creole, French Creole from Louisiana. So I was giving them this Creole text and saying, okay, I want you guys to annotate, but focus on the variation. Anything that's variable. This word seems to be spelled like this here, and that word seems to be spelled like that there. What might that mean? Okay, so this is basically doing a linguistic structural analysis of the text. It's one way to go about it. And let me just show you, and they did use lots of, so this word here, S-O, you click on that, and it shows you, okay, so papa, Ali, which means it could be read as, and again, these are French speakers, so they know that this could be papa, so P-A-P-A, so dad, father. And then this might be, this is the possessive, right? So his father. That makes sense. And this could be son papa à lui. Okay, so what is down here? It's so la bouche. Bouche is mouth, something the mouth. This would be weird then. So this is exactly the kinds of things that they're looking for. So word clouds really help locate then different properties of the text very quickly. Okay, so as I was saying, we have, this is the word cloud. Over here, we have then a tag cloud. They didn't tag it very much. I gave this to them as homework. So somebody said savoir equals connaître. So these are two verbs of knowing in French. If I click on this, okay, I don't know why that did that. Let me give you a better, let me move to the comments. So here are all the comments that were made. I only had 6 students, and we have lots and lots and lots of comments on this. If you want to look at all of them, read all of them, okay? But you don't typically read all of them like that. And, you know, there are pages and pages of comments. We're trying this out, so we can actually take all the comments and create comment clouds out of it. This turns out to be a very handy, we added this little button. So we can look at, if you have a class, who's annotating, because I want to find out, okay, C. Blythe, I wonder who that is. Anna for 5 annotations, Adam for Laura for Florence, 35. Okay. Florence behaves on the internet like she does in real life. She's always the person, you ask a question, her hand is up, and she has 5 paragraphs to say. Other people will just give you the answer, right? So that was interesting. So if we click on, well, let's just click on Florence. No, I'm going to click on Jenna just to show you. Okay, so it also then shows me as a teacher all of Jenna's comments together. I can go back and click on each one to see what Jenna has to say. And it's interesting because you can then see different people's reading patterns. What kinds of things do they focus on in the text? Certain students look at certain things, which is kind of fascinating to me. Let's see. An apostrophe usually denotes, I'll just take a look at what she has to say. An apostrophe usually denotes, so here's grand-maman, so it's an apostrophe, dit que mon grand-papa, so, and you can also click on it to highlight the text. So this is the part that she annotated, and then this is what she submitted. It usually denotes an element that's been deleted. I'm wondering if this differs in pronunciation from that. Okay, so they're just going through and doing what I want them to do, and this gives them the tools to do it. So now, let me go back to my talk and finish up. So far, so good. So I started getting into the literature on reading from both the social perspective and a cognitive perspective. And this book, I know I'm up here kind of talking about books and books about books, but this is a really terrific book about the reading process. Marianne Wolf has written Proust and the Squid. And I must admit the title, because it had Proust in it, that attracted me, right? So as a French professor, I thought, Proust and the Squid. The idea here is that the brain is, Proust is the humanist. When she talks as a humanist, and the whole humanist discourse about reading. The squid, she looks at different kinds of animals and their brains and how they're wired. And so that's this kind of the cognitive science side. And of course, her point is that you really need to talk about the story and the science of reading. But she says near the end, the question that emerges from all this research is this: what would be lost to us if we replace the skills honed by the reading brain with those now being formed in our new generation of digital natives who sit and read transfixed before a screen? So it goes back to that question, are you reading when you're on the internet? Is it the same? Is it different? And these are really, it's a very provocative question for foreign language educators, and I think we can kind of reframe them or generate even more questions. So what is lost and what is gained by this kind of notion of group reading? Clearly, I mean, I must admit, I don't always like to read with 100 other people. There are times when I like to do it alone. Thank you very much. But there are times when I really enjoy to read other people's comments. They make me angry sometimes, but they can be very worthwhile. So I'm not suggesting that this be used for everything. How appropriate are our metaphors? So the Gutenberg Parenthesis is a metaphor, secondary orality, all these kinds of ways that we conceptualize what's going on. David Birdsong's talk the other day, he was talking about reframing this notion of bilingualism. It used to be thought of in terms of deficits, and now we've shifted the frame and talking about capacities. It's not just what L2 learners can't do, but what can they do. And I notice in this discussion that people adopt different frames. So, these reading practices are replacing those old and treasured practices. I don't think the replacement frame is actually true. I think that I have learned new ways to read, but I haven't given up my old ways. So absorption, revolution, I don't know. What are the, and maybe this is the more important, the consequences, the pedagogical practices associated with Web 2.0 or Web 2.0 or 3.0, so this kind of participatory culture, what's going on that may really be important for us to adopt for our classrooms? This question was given to me by Stephen Thorne, who is a professor in second language studies at Portland State. How authentic is second language CMC, computer-mediated communication, in the framework of a course compared with social gaming or networking media. That's where he's thinking about it, because he's thinking about gaming discourse. That's a form of reading and interaction. So the notion of authenticity. And how can we facilitate even more real-world, authentic, and autonomous digital communication while still being instructed? So we're trying to find the sweet spot of a lot of these more open tools. So let me end with this picture, which of looking at all the different pictures was my favorite of reading technology. Kids in the 50s reading comic books with, I guess they're 3D glasses, I don't know. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be very interested in any questions and comments. Yes?
Does eComma know a language? Can you put any language in there?
Okay, that's a great question. So I'm showing you Creole French. We're trying to make this open for any language. So if you can upload the text, right, you can comment on it, right? So the point about an open tool is that it's not a language-specific tool, right?
So it's Cyrillic, and other fonts could be also.
Yes, I'm looking at Natalie, and she's saying,
Natalie? Yes.
That's a very big, yeah, that's the obvious question. So we've been testing it primarily in in European languages, but, well, we've yet to test it on Cyrillic, but yes, it works in principle.
Should work with Cyrillic then. The other, are the vocabulary clouds self-generated? Because when you put in the text, the clouds, word clouds, are they self-generating?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so the text, that's the program.
So, I mean, we could host an installation for test reasons, but this is actually built in Drupal, so anybody can download the module and use it with their Drupal installation.
So she's talking about this is built in Drupal, which is an open software. So absolutely. So if you want to tweak it or add something on, you can. That's the whole point of open source. Yes, in the back.
Yes, this is a fascinating subject, and especially since in these late years, there's a tendency to use more internet-based services or tools. My accountant says that he's still using paper.
Mm-hmm.
And here I learned in this country that there should always be a plan B.
Mm-hmm.
So if we base everything we know, everything we believe in, or everything we want to use online, what happens if, we have no power, we have no electricity? So where's the plan B in that sense?
Right. Well, I think you've already answered that. Okay, first of all, I'm not saying, look how long it took me to get this damn thing hooked up today. So you're absolutely right. And I was thinking of not plan Bs, but plan Cs and everything else. So I could have gone and given this talk without any of this. So I'm not here saying that everything, all your reading practices, the way you should teach reading should be answered by eComma. Not at all. But it is interesting to think about then, like the affordances. What is this cost-benefit analysis? What is lost and what is gained by moving to this different environment? So certainly, you lose something, and it's robust technology that never crashes and fails. So at Coral, we still have multiple ways of delivering content, and surveys shows that people still want print. So it's not as though, that's why I was saying the replacement frame, no, I don't really think that that's appropriate. I think that it's now, there's this multiplicity of options, and so it's good to offer people. But I'm not here preaching that we move everything to the digital world. No. Yes?
My question is about testing, because if students are used to learning how to read in this collaborative style, then you have to test them in similar form.
Right.
So if they're used to sharing and say, I'll take the verbs, you take the
Right.
adjectives, then how do you get them in a room and say, okay,
That's a great question. So yeah, if they have this different practice, which I don't necessarily have, and they're better at it than I am, shouldn't I test them? And there would be people who are going to disagree on this. But yes, so there are new ways of testing collaboration. Jim Lantoff and Poehler at Penn State has come up with something called dynamic assessment, which is very much along these lines that instead of testing an individual, doing with a paper and pencil test, reading by him or herself, that you actually test collaboration, because that's what we do with language. Language is not simply, individual cognition. It's more of this notion of distributed cognition. But I haven't gone there yet, so I'm not an expert on that. But there is the rise of the research called dynamic assessment. So do a Google search and you'll find information about that. Yes?
I'm all about reading books as well, but I see this infinite possibilities of teaching reading comprehension of foreign language in the classroom.
Right.
I think this will really speak to the generation of students we're dealing with today, and it's really accessible. So the possibilities are infinite. My question is this platform flexible enough to not only teach reading comprehension, but other reading aspects, such as maybe inputting grammar lessons, vocab, things like that, building on it?
Right. So I've seen teachers use this I would say yes, it's very flexible because it's very simple. All you do is you have a text that you can annotate, and then what you're talking about, the pedagogical goals, depend on how you frame the activity. So I've seen teachers go through and focus on verb tenses, for example, and they want their students just to go through and choose the different kinds of, so what you could do offline with printed text, but the whole point is to come up with a tool that focuses them on properties of doing textual analysis. So absolutely, what I was doing with the students in the linguistics class was basically grammatical analysis. It was the first step of looking at what did you see in variation, and then I had my own teacher agenda here of what I wanted to show them. So yeah, I've seen it used in kind of literature classrooms to teach them about tropes or to teach them about figures of speech, but I've also seen teachers use it to teach vocabulary in a very explicit way or to teach grammatical structures. Yeah.
It struck me listening to your very excellent presentation as a historical analogy. I'm a historian, so anyway, the Chinese in their literary and philosophical tradition, going back probably more than 2,000 years, obviously not electronic, but this is what they did. That were in the core texts of Chinese philosophical tradition, which are very important because they govern how people should live their lives and how the state should be run. People would comment on them over hundreds of years or more. And so there was, when you were reading these, like when I was in graduate school, in classical Chinese, you read these texts. Some of them are rather short, like the Art of War, that a lot of people are familiar with, and Sun Tzu in the military, but that's just one. And then you have many, many pages of comments. And the comments could be spaced out over hundreds of years.
Right.
People commenting and commenting on the comments. So a big part of studying the text was you read the original text and then you read these comments.
Exactly.
Help you understand.
I'm glad you mentioned the historical point of view, because when I presented this to literary scholars, the people who get excited about this are people in medieval studies or in classics, because there's this tradition of commentary and marginalia, writing in the margin. So, and that's actually, in some respects, more interesting than the actual text itself, so what happens in the sidelines. So I'm told I'm out of time, but I'll certainly be able to take your questions, and I'll stick around for a little while. Thank you very much for your attention.